welcome back. In this section today, we will discuss about UN's role in conflict resolution. Having studied the definition of conflict resolutions and other terminologies associated to conflict prevention or management, here today in UN's role in conflict resolution, we will basically discuss or learn about what is the contribution of Article 6 and 7 majorly in UN peacekeeping operations and how that helps for international conflict resolution. As we have already learned that when it comes to UN's role in conflict resolution, it's primarily chapter 6 and 7, which comprises of article 33 to 38 and article 39 to 51 respectively, are primarily responsible for conflict resolution under this provision. Here in conflict chapter 6, as we have learned before, it is basically the pacific settlement of dispute methods which we resort to for international conflict resolution, and under chapter 7, whenever there is threat to international peace or breaches of peace and acts of aggression, in that case what kind of preventive measures can be taken by UN or what kind of actions can be taken by UN, that we will discuss bit in details. Conflict resolution, as you see, it has developed theoretical insights in the nature and sources of conflict and how conflict can be resolved through peaceful methods to effectuate durable settlement or sustainable peace. Here, coming to chapter 6, this slide is about the overview of article 33 to 38, what is there. Part of it we have already discussed, that it is about settling international disputes and conflict and the Security Council's power in relation to this kind of conflict settlement. Resolution under chapter 6 are advisory in nature, unlike chapter 7 where it is binding on the conflicting parties. These resolutions have generally been operative only with the consent of all parties at all level, where all the parties who are involved in the conflict have to give the consent for this resolution to take place. And traditionally, the chapter has not been interpreted to support collective intervention, or it is support the idea of collective security, which is more prominent under chapter 7. Coming to more comprehensive view or the article wise view of what is there in chapter 6, you can see in this slide that it is about pacific settlement of dispute, under which what is the key action that seek a solution by any kind of peaceful means. As in conflict resolution methods, we have seen there are primarily two methods, one is peaceful methods, another is coercive methods. In peaceful methods, the means of conflict resolution that we resort to, whether it is kind of negotiations or any kind of agreement, pacific settlement of disputes, good offices, this generally comes under conflict resolution methods under chapter 6. Under chapter 30, article 33, what you can see is that state involved in a dispute or any kind of conflict that might entrench international peace must first seek a solution by peaceful means, that comes under article 33. And if you see the methods of conflict resolution under this article that has been mentioned, whether it is negotiation, inquiry, good offices, then conciliation, arbitration, judicial settlement, all this comes under the peaceful settlement or pacific settlement of dispute part of conflict resolution and not necessarily the coercive method, which is the cornerstone of this chapter. Article 34, what is the UNSC's or Security Council's role in conflict resolution under this chapter is that UN Security Council will determine if the continuation of the conflict is likely endanger international peace, that can endanger international peace, or it can have long term effect, or if the conflict might take a bigger shape in future, that Security Council determines. allow the and also as we see the key action obviously to proactively examine the condition or the conflict situation that is in place. In chapter 36 necessarily its evinces recommendations accordingly, where the advices on how to settle the dispute, which method of conflict resolution or peaceful method of conflict resolution needs to be chosen for conflict settlement in that case. The advices on how settlement of dispute, whether it is through judicial method or through arbitration or negotiation, that is being suggested by Security Council. Obviously, there is no imposition of any kind of solution, as we have said this is not binding on nature, and Security Council mainly plays a advisory role in this case. Coming to what is the relation about with chapter 7, because after this we will learn more about chapter 7 and traditional peacekeeping and different kind of peacekeeping method. Here we see that we have discussed before, it is non-binding in nature unlike chapter 7, and whereas if the peaceful methods of conflict resolution fails to bring about any kind of peaceful solution to the conflict or any kind of resolution to the conflict, in that case we proceed to chapter 7 and the dispute becomes a threat to international peace. If that is what is been determined by UNSC or that has been arrived at, then what happened? We move on to the measures or conflict resolution methods under chapter 7. Coming to one of the component of it is the conflict resolution under UN, preventive diplomacy. What we see here is that during Cold War, UN was remedial, or UN conflict resolution method was mostly remedial than preventive. What do we understand by that? So, when you are talking about remedial and not preventing, is that the political limitations of UNSC, what basically we are talking about the veto power of the UN members that was imposed on Iran during the bipolar global rivalry during the Cold War time. The UN could only act in a remedial capacity, whereas managing the symptoms of the conflict, because the superpowers blocked any action that would have required the UN to actively intervene and prevent any kind of causes of conflict. UN could not agree on forceful or any kind of preventive measures like sanctions or any kind of coercive method of conflict resolution, because that might have been vetoed. The most common action was deployment of first generation peacekeeping forces. We will discuss details about first generation and the subsequent second and third and fourth generation of peacekeeping forces in next few slides. Here, as we see during the Cold War, when it was a bipolar war with the UN members, basically because of the veto power there, UN could not impose any kind of coercive method of conflict resolution. There we basically see the kind of conflict resolution method that is UN is resorting to is basically the peaceful method of conflict resolution, which is basically the first generation peacekeeping forces, deployment of first generation peacekeeping forces or traditional peacekeeping forces. And whereas in most of the cases this kind of missions were sent after a ceasefire has been announced, or in a kind of more peaceful or stable situation has been arrived at, after that peacekeeping forces were sent. And obviously under this, as this comes under chapter 6, this condition also needed the consent of all the parties in the conflict. Apart from that, you see that preventive diplomacy is a kind of preventive tool of conflict resolution that works kind of as a precursor of peacemaking, and the use of diplomatic techniques to prevent disputes arising from any kind of conflicting situations, then prevent them from escalating into armed or a bigger level conflict. That is the main objective of employing preventive diplomacy as one of the measures of conflict resolution. As we understand by the discussion here that the preventive diplomacy is a measure that excludes any kind of non-diplomatic measures, whether it is economic sanctions or coercive method. Now, coming more about the preventive diplomacy, it is a action, as it is a preventive action, as a precursor of peacemaking, as you have seen. It is taken at the earliest possible stage of any conflict to prevent any kind of conflict escalation. The concept of preventive diplomacy, this part is very important, because it focus here that the concept of preventive diplomacy, it was articulated by former UN Secretary General Dag Hammarskjöld and later formalized by Boutros Ghali. The Agenda for Peace document, which is a very popular and important document in 1992, there it was first the idea was given as a distinct and crucial step in the UN sequential strategy for peace. In the document Agenda for Peace in 1992, 5 elements of preventive diplomacy has been suggested there as part of conflict resolution. These 5 elements we will discuss between details, as you can see. First point being the confidence building measures between the parties and fact finding missions, wherein confidence building measures, what you understand by CBAMs is that is the actions that are taken by both the parties in conflict to a dispute to reduce the mutual fear or any kind of escalation or aggression that might be causing a possibility of a future large scale conflict, and thereby it is creating a climate of a risk reduction center, or a climate of obviously conducive dialogue through which the conflict resolution can be arrived at. Examples of CBMs is obviously any kind of dialogue that helps to reduce the tension or ease the tension between the parties, whether it is military missions for ceasefire or creation of regional and sub-regional awareness centers about the conflict for the people. So, that comes under CBMs. Fact finding mission is the deploying neutral missions or envoys or special representative to a crisis area from both the conflicting parties, so that there are both the parties know about each other's development at each other's sides. Coming to the other elements of preventive diplomacy, or this early warning or preventive deployment or demilitarization as suggested by Agenda for Peace. Here in early warning, what we see is basically a systematic collection and analysis evidence of potential environmental damage, any kind of nuclear accident or any other kind of hazardous accident that might happen, population movement, threat of famine and spread of disease or any kind of such important environmental issues or problem that might happen, to identify potential conflict, any like resources, conflict based on resources. So, in that case the collection and analysis of this kind of data and evidences by both the sides is basically early warning that helps to ease the tensions, as both the parties are already aware about the elements of the issue that might actually give rise to a bigger conflict in future. Preventive deployment is placing peacekeeping or any kind of observation of military forces in a volatile area to physically deter the outbreak of any kind of violence in future. So, it helps to, it's like the deployment of these militaries basically now helps to ease any kind of future tension between the parties. Demilitarization, as we see between the North and South Korea present day, is a creating of area between the conflicting areas where military activities and personnel are prohibited or strictly limited or kept at the minimal level. The serving as a buffer zone between the conflicting areas, and that separates the opposing forces, so that it also contributes to easing the tension between the parties, at as there is some buffer zone between the conflicting parties, between the military's deployment. At that at the buffer zone, obviously the deployment of military is a minimal or not present at all. Other kind of elements that helps to is the tension of any conflict at the very primitive stage is all this kind of elements, as you can see, whether it is intergovernmental diplomacy, citizens diplomacy, economic diplomacy, third party intervention by civil society organizations, which is very important part of any kind of conflict resolution, women's diplomacy, communications diplomacy, peace education and awareness uh, among the mass about peace education, how conflict situation can be taken care of, how tension can be eased, and creative or celebrity diplomacy. Coming to chapter 7 of UN and how that contribute to conflict resolution, as I've discussed before, is that here in chapter 7, UN suggests more coercive kind of conflict resolution, unlike chapter 6, where basically it was dealing with the pacific settlement of dispute method. Here, as you see, the what is the purpose of the chapter 7 is that it authorizes the Security Council to take coercive action to maintain or restore international peace, where the method of chapter 6 is not working or peaceful method of conflict resolution is not working. As you see that the acts as the collective security system, resolutions are binding on the parties. We have already discussed this before, and this is also a major difference with chapter 6, where we are not supporting the idea of collective security, but it is in chapter 7 where is basically even empowers the idea of collective security. In Article 39, you see what humanity first determine the existence of a threat to the international peace or breach to peace. As you have seen in previous chapter, also in chapter 6, that humanity is determining whether that conflict has any kind of possibility to take any bigger shape in future. Here we see whether the conflict has any potential for to threat to international peace or breach of peace or act of aggression, and accordingly conflict resolution methods are suggested. The formal determination is a mandatory first step for chapter 7 to be implemented for conflict resolution. Non-military actions under Article 41, it is that it is short of force. It imposes a coercive method where directly forces are not being used, any kind of military forces are not being used to compel the parties, but it can be any kind of economic sanctions or boycott of goods, imports and exports, through which the party can be compelled to act in a certain way or compelled to de-escalate the conflicting situation. It includes, as I said, the sanctions or economic and communication links can be cut off, and serving diplomatic relations can be cut off, and that works as a coercive method. If you remember, when you are discussing about conflict resolution methods, these methods basically, whether it's communication links, cutting off communication links, or economic relation or imposing sanctions, that comes under coercive method short of war. So in chapter 7 we are discussing about that. Military actions under Article 42, it authorizes the use of force when non-use of force and other kind of coercive method is not working or fails to address the conflict in a proper way. Then in Article 42, UNEC authorizes use of force basically for self defense if non-military measures fails, obviously. It can authorize military operation by air, sea or land forces of member states. So, chapter 42 is different from 41 in the sense in chapter 42 use of forces are being suggested, whereas in 41 it is not direct use of forces, but other kind of coercive method of conflict resolution that the state can resort to, and then for a conflict resolution method. And Article 99 is also relevant in this perspective, where Secretary General that advises or authorizes to bring potential relevant situation to the Council's attention where it has the potential for breach of peace or any kind of future large scale aggression. Under chapter 8, as we have seen in past also, that the link between chapter 6 and 7, here you see the link between chapter 7 and 8 is that to peacefully resolve any kind of local disputes through regional arrangement or agencies or taking help of the regional organizations, that is also being suggested by UNSC. Here we come to the concept of UN peacekeeping, and very interestingly, as you can see here, it evolves, you see that the peacekeeping evolves in the gradation between pacific settlement and military enforcement for as a method of conflict resolution. The UN Secretary General Diagram of Code, this describes the peacekeeping as falling under chapter 6 and half. This is a very important point because of its unique nature of conflict resolution, where it falls between passive settlement and military enforcement. It is suggested that UN peacekeeping is actually describes at chapter 6 and half. Here we will basically discuss about the different kind of peacekeeping that has evolved over the time and with the changing nature of conflict, starting with the traditional peacekeeping, or the idea of traditional peacekeeping, which I just seen that was kind of deployed during the bipolar world or bipolar world conflict or during the Cold War. It was obviously to create an environment conducive to efforts at peaceful conflict resolution by the belligerents or the conflicting parties. Deployment of an interpositional buffer force between the front lines among the conflicting parties, and thus reducing the contact between the parties and hence limit the escalation of conflict. And it is also uh, been deployed obviously where there is a possibility of escalation of any kind of conflict. It focused on the freezing conflict, and example of such traditional peacekeeping missions is obviously the United Nations Truce Supervision Organization in Middle East in 48 and 49. As you see the timing, that was mostly the UN peacekeeping operations during the Cold War time. Here at the robust or multidimensional peacekeeping under chapter 7, as it suggested, as you say that under chapter 7 is robust and multidimensional peacekeeping. Why I say that? That it authorizes to use necessary forces at tactical level to protect people and the mission's mandate. Um, as you have learned that peacekeeping doesn't basically exactly fall under any single or explicitly defined chapter in the UN Charter. It is a ad hoc intervention that draws its legal and political authority from both chapter 6 and chapter 7, and sometimes from other few sections as well. Because of this hybrid nature, basically, we say that peacekeeping falls under chapter 6 and half. Here we say under the robust or multi-dimensional peacekeeping, we say that emerged primarily after the Cold War, and it responds to the failure of the traditional peacekeeping. So, as we see the first portion of peacekeeping during Cold War, which was employed is the traditional peacekeeping, the robust or multidimensional, more comprehensive kind of peacekeeping idea was emerged after Cold War. And now we will come to the point that why it is called probably robust is because the forces can be used not only for self-defense as it was during the traditional peacekeeping mission, but also for the defense of the mandate and most critically for the protections of civilian, which is a very important point and new addition when it comes to robust peacekeeping. Coming to the idea of second generation of peacekeeping, what you see is the main point is it is more ambitious mandates and active involvement not only in freezing the conflict at a point, but also in assisting the transition to peace. So, here in second generation peacekeeping, what we see, it is not only freezing the conflict, but also it is assisting in the transitioning to the next step of peaceful negotiation. As you can see in the chart, there are basically the main points on second generation peacekeeping. Obviously, it has it helps to reduce the conflict, whether it's interstate conflicts and post-conflict transition. As I have just mentioned, the main point or main feature of second generation peacekeeping, whether it's civil wars or state collapse is happening in case of interstate conflict. The mandate is obviously multidimensional, shifted from purely military monitoring to civilian tasks, so that there can be more or stable peace situation after a violent conflict. It is not only freezing the conflict by deploying some military forces, but also transitioning in the next step. Authority still primarily based on the consent of the conflicting parties, and it also expands beyond the chapter 6 roles, and it mainly focuses on the negotiating the peace agreements after any conflict happens. We can see few successful and some failures of second generation peacekeeping. In third generation, we see one of the main point is that it increased the permission to use force to impose the aims of a mission's mandate. So, as we see, as we navigate from traditional to robust peacekeeping and second and third generation peacekeeping, we see there gradually the use of force or use of coercive method is increasing for conflict resolution. In third generation, while is in second generation, we are suggesting freezing the conflict by using probably military forces or creating a buffer zone and then working on the second step of peaceful resolution. In third generation, there are more permission to use force to impose the aims of the mission's mandate. These missions are typically dispatched under chapter 7. As you have seen, the use of force for self-defense is only allowed in chapter 7. There, here we see environment where the peace is absent or highly fragile. It is kind of, it has been imposed in a conflicted situation which has escalated from a stable peace situation. And there, obviously the environment is highly fragile, whether it's failed state or persistent armed groups or any kind of violent civil war, it can be employed. The mandate of the peacekeeping is obviously more robust, and enforcement happens because of the use of force. Explicitly authorizes, UNSC authorizes under chapter 7 to use the force beyond self-defense, which is very important to note, to actively define the mandate of the peacekeeping missions, whether it's protecting the civilians or securing the humanitarian accesses. Authority, as you understand from the kind of peacekeeping missions that is employed under this, it is obviously coercive in nature, and it is often deployed without the full consent of all the local authorities or armed groups. Focus is obviously on protection of civilians. It is beyond just freezing the conflict or trying to reduce the intensity of the conflict, but at the same time protecting the civilians, and as you have seen before, also securing the humanitarian access is one of the most important element of this kind of peacekeeping missions, and obviously also securing and transitioning to the next step of more stable situation. Fourth generation, coming to fourth generation, it is obviously comprehensive efforts to identify and support structure which will tend to consolidate peace. This is more of a transitioning to the next step of more peaceful situation, and it is a comprehensive effort towards that. The line between peacekeeping and peace enforcement, that is how we describe fourth generation. It is obvious, as we have seen in case of third generation peacekeeping, it is also deployed in a highly volatile or it is applied in a highly volatile or fragile conflict situation. That is, it can be facing the terrorism or transitional organized crime and complex system, complex or systematic threats, kind of that. In case of mandate, it integrated political strategy, prioritizing the identification and support of a sustainable political solution while maintaining core protection of civilians' mandate. Authority is smart peacekeeping using advanced technology, whether it is drone or ISO, for protection and awareness. Focus is partnership with regional organizations. As you have seen before, also in some cases UN also try to seek help of the regional active regional organizations which can play a very active role in case of easing out any kind of tension or conflict situation. So, here we see the partnership with the regional organizations like African Union or any kind of regional organization which is existing in a conflicting or volatile zone, and help with the help of the regional organization trying to ease out the conflict at the place, and obviously achieving measurable transition focused outcomes where it can be more transition towards peace building effort of UN, which we will discuss in the next lecture. So, to summarize this lecture, here basically we have discussed about UN's role in conflict resolution, primarily chapter 6 and 7, how pacific settlement of dispute methods of conflict resolution are adopted under chapter 7, and the coercive method, mostly the coercive method without war situations are adopted under chapter 7, how use of force is being suggested or authorized by UNSC, that we discuss in this lecture. In the next part of it, we will delve more deeper into the UN peace building efforts and how that is being implemented in any kind of conflicted situation, primarily after peacekeeping efforts are successful. Thank you very much.